Hello, my name is Steve Pollard. I'm going to briefly run through some of the issues that children with fetal valproate syndrome are likely to experience, have as part of their diagnosis, and the ways in which they will struggle to interact and to answer questions for people at various different stages. Um, My background is that we have four children that are affected by fetal valproate syndrome, and they range currently in age from 33 down to 21. Um, One of the big things is that as they go through life, it's not a fixed set of symptoms which they exhibit and they have. Um, as you get through things at an earlier age, you will gradually get to understand and to be able to manage and maintain and support them through various different things that they're having trouble with, such as social communication. It's very, very common for them to have few, if any, friends at all, particularly at school. If they do have friends, then they will tend to be other children that do have their own particular difficulties. They will tend to gravitate towards those. They very commonly will have social communication difficulties. They will find it difficult to interact with people in what is regarded as a sort of neurotypical way. Um, this will then cause them to become more and more alienated within schools as they go through it. A lot of schools do not recognise the way or the difficulties that these children have, and because they don't necessarily all have a confirmed diagnosis of all of the different issues that they have combined to create the fetal valproate syndrome, then it's very difficult for them to understand how to put things in place to actually provide best for the children. Also, as things go through and they get older, they get better at actually coping with some of the issues, and some of the issues will then, or different issues will then surface at a later date. So it's very common for children as they get older, particularly as they're in the teens, early 20s, etc., to actually find that they're developing other difficulties such as major anxieties, depression, reclusiveness is quite a common one as well. Very difficult to get them out of their room and interacting with any other people on any level, even parents. And it just seems to keep changing as they do get older. You get your head round one thing and then suddenly something else pops up, which makes it very difficult to manage. In situations where they're needing to interact with people, such as a PIP interview, a universal credits interview of some description, or DLA if it's a younger child, then they will find that extremely difficult. They will not often want to say much at all. And if they do actually say things, then they will find it difficult to actually express and understand a lot of the time what the whole effects of the difficulties that they have are. Because they're so complex and so interrelated, and that it's not just one thing, then it makes it very difficult for them to understand it, because as they've been growing older, they haven't actually noticed any difference, because it's obviously happened to them over a long period of time. What can be very unsettling for them is that you can find that there are quite a number of people out there who have not had full diagnoses and don't get those, sometimes not at all, but sometimes they will get parts of it at a much later date. For example, one of our older children is now 33. Just over a year ago, about 18 months ago, he had severe mental problems and coping with those. He had a breakdown basically, and was sectioned, and following that, which was actually a good thing, he was then referred to and assessed not only for autism but for fetal valproate syndrome, and they also discovered that he had bipolar. Now, he's got all the way through to being 32 years old at that time before that diagnosis actually came up, and before people were starting to actually support him in the right way. We'd always treated him as though he had autism, but at that point, all the way through until then, he didn't want to accept it, and therefore we couldn't force on him, or didn't want to force on him, actually having any assessments or diagnoses in that sort of area. We still talked to him and did things in the same way that we did with the other children that have got autism. They've got ADHD, sleep apnea. I mean, one of them stops breathing 42 times per hour when he's asleep, so is obviously extremely fatigued. They've all got problems with their limbs and joints. They get a lot of pain from those. They get a lot of fatigue. That's extremely common. And as I said before, the social communication side of things is extremely difficult, and they will misunderstand things, and that can cause quite a lot of conflicts and things in the way that they will actually relate to people and interact with them, even their peer group. And what you quite often find is that their friends, if and when they eventually get some, it's usually quite a lot later in life. And also they tend to quite often be younger, or they will be people that have very similar difficulties, because they're understood and they don't judge each other, which is the main thing. They get very anxious, very isolated, and quite often will self-harm, to the point of actually on numerous occasions, for a very extended period, being on suicide watch. So again, they will internalize things rather than making things public, even if it's to parents and people they trust. Situations where they're having an interview, they will find it very difficult to actually explain things properly or in a very straightforward way for the interviewer to actually comprehend what they're actually trying to say. It's a case of actually having the experience and being used to working with children, adults, etc., that have significant social communication difficulties. And that's not an easy thing to do, and it's not an easy thing to get. The difficulties that they have, as I say, do keep changing. The underlying condition is fetal valproate syndrome, but there are so many different things within that spectrum that it's a hugely different combination of issues for every single child, even though they have that overall diagnosis of the same thing. We had ourselves, as parents of children affected, along with another friend of ours who we worked with for a number of years, had a meeting at the DWP for working with the assessors, or the providers for the assessors, back in March of 2020, and they were creating a condition insight report for fetal valproate syndrome. One of our children recently had a universal credits assessment, and the interviewer, taking the details, had never heard of and had no understanding or no knowledge of that. So even after this amount of time, that still has not filtered through, and people still do not know what fetal valproate syndrome is. It would be really nice if people would actually take the time and effort to actually look at it and see what the details are, how it can affect, and then actually take that into the interview with them and ask the person that you're interviewing how things affect them. They will explain it to you, but it may be very long-winded, and it may be very difficult to comprehend how that actually interacts with everything else that they have to do within their lives. This probably sounds like a load of waffle, but it is a very hard thing to actually try and explain, because every single child is different and it will affect them differently. They may have a lot of things the same, they will have the same diagnosis, but the way that they present and the way that they will be able to communicate with you will be significantly different. Hope that helps at least a little bit, and good luck. Thank you.